Good morning, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News. Today is Tuesday, the 14th day of October, 2025. And the situation today, the day after the historic return of the 20 living hostages after 2 years of being held captive by the murderous Hamas terrorists, well, the situation is anything but good. In fact, it's very problematic today as we're going to look at the issues that are before us. So let's get right to them. Three stories. First, from the Jewish News Syndicate that kind of lays it all out. After the joyous liberation, Trump's deal will be tested. And then we have this story from the Times of Israel. The mother of a slain hostage says the government actually betrayed families like hers because the deal left insufficient leverage over Hamas to get the bodies back. And again, we mentioned yesterday there were supposed to be 28 bodies returned. Only four were returned, which leads us to our third story. After Hamas breaches the deal, which they certainly did, Israel fears the group is hiding deceased hostages for future negotiations, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. Also, to a couple of housekeeping issues. We're going to do our second edition of Breaking News about 7 hours from now. We're going to record it about noon Pacific time. It's a little before 5 a.m. now. We're recording this first edition of Breaking News. And the reason we're going to have the second one earlier than usual is because at 2 p.m. today, 2 p.m. Pacific time, I'm on the air with Tom Hughes live on his website. Hope for Our Times is a live program we'll be doing, talking about exactly what we're talking about today and taking your questions too. So that's 2 p.m. Hope for Our Times today, 2 p.m. Pacific with Tom Hughes. Again, it's 5 a.m. right now on the West Coast, so it'll be about 9 hours from now if my math is correct. All right, so look forward to seeing you there if you can possibly watch it. All right, here's what's going on. Let's just summarize it, and this kind of says it in a nutshell. The worry is that Hamas won't disarm but will remain in control. They're counting on two things to succeed. First, the war is over and Donald Trump is eager to proclaim the ceasefire has taken place and a new Middle East will emerge. He is the peacemaker, so further fighting is not an option. And second, Israel, after 2 years of fighting, is doing everything it can and did everything it could to get the living hostages back. Well, they are back, they've succeeded. So it's time to get back to normal, right? The last thing they want to do is do it all over again and fight with Hamas back in Gaza. Remember, the war is supposed to be over. Hamas is counting on this with their stalling tactics to remain in power. And that's what these stories are going to illustrate. Now, the first one, like we said, is an excellent one from the Jewish News Syndicate. And it's a long story. We're only going to do about half of it here for time's sake, but you'll get the drift. After the joyous liberation, Trump's deal will be tested. If Hamas won't disarm or give up power in Gaza, will a president who is basking in the title of peacemaker or an exhausted Israeli public let the terrorists get away with it? And that's the question. Will they let Hamas get away with it? They won't disarm. Combined with the prospect that the longest war in Israeli history is also ending, the reaction to the freedom of the captives is going to transcend past examples in which hostages held by terrorists were let go or rescued, and likely to be remembered as a seminal moment in modern Jewish history. And this is true. Yesterday was a historic day, and across the board, everybody is saying that. And here it is. This is exactly what the people who planned, executed, and cheered for the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust are counting on. Well, what's going on here? But aside from releasing the living hostages and presumably some of the bodies of the slain captives they've been holding, it's far from clear that Hamas has any intention of fulfilling the rest of the demands put upon them by Trump, including the disarming and giving up of their control of Gaza. Instead, we're told that Hamas's surrender will only come as part of, here we go, negotiations that have been put off so as to not to interfere with the achievement of the hostages release. That was the upshot of an interview with the Prime Minister of Qatar published in the New York Times the day before the hostage released. Now, many observers have assumed that the hostages were the only leverage that Hamas still had in negotiations with Israel and the United States. But clearly now, this may have been wrong. Why? Well, perhaps the prodding of their Qatar funders and allies who have, with the help of Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner, they've wormed their way into Trump's good graces. The terrorists have realized that their cruel insistence on holding into the hostages was actually an impediment to their potential survival. Now, how is that possible? Holding on to the hostages was an impediment? And the article said it's really simple. The advantage that Hamas now holds is twofold, and now we're going to look at them. One is that Trump is eager, even desperate, for the ceasefire to hold to keep playing the role of the world's leading peacemaker. That's a title he will lose if, as he has also promised, he will give up the green light. He will give the green light for Israel to obliterate Hamas if it fails to disarm and give up control. In other words, if Israel goes back and wipes out Hamas, there goes the peacemaker title. Yet the hard part in implementing the vision of the U.S. president is what follows the release of the hostages. If Hamas thinks that they can talk and negotiate its way out of surrendering Gaza, and the terrorists have every reason to believe that Qatar will back them up, then Trump's diplomatic triumph will fall short of the claims being asserted by the administration. In his statements in the last week and the speech he made before the Knesset yesterday, he spoke as if he not only solved the riddle of how to end the post-October 7th war, he also seems to think that this agreement will allow the revival of the 2020 Abraham Accords. And of course, that was his signature foreign policy achievement in his first term. And it will lead to peace breaking out throughout the Middle East. He even mentioned the possibility of a peace deal with the Islamist regime in Iran. The article goes on to say, we should all pray that he's right about the prospects for peace. Still, the odds are, notwithstanding assurances from Qatar that the conflict with the Palestinians and Hamas is far from over, so long as Palestinians, whether supporters of Hamas or the supposedly more moderate Fatah party that runs the corrupt Palestinian Authority, as long as they still believe that their national identity is inextricably linked to a war on the Jews and Zionism, then all the Trumpian optimism in the world won't matter. So here's the key. Hamas is doubtless counting on Trump not being willing to admit that the peace he seeks is likely to require continued fighting until the last Hamas operatives have been disarmed, fled, or have been killed. If the talks stall, as Hamas digs in its heels, will the president, here's the big question, will he be willing to be smeared as the fomenter of Palestinian genocide and to give up the praise he's gotten from brokering a deal that many of even his most bitter enemies and bitter political opponents are applauding him for? It's amazing how a lot of Democrats are applauding him for what he did. Now, those who want a Middle East free from Islamic terror, let alone a secure Israel or a Palestinian political culture, freed from its obsessions with destroying Israel, should hope that he's sufficiently tough-minded to stick to his insistence that the terms of the deal are non-negotiable. But Qatar will likely be urging him to demand that the Jewish state not restart the war under any circumstances, even if Hamas doesn't disarm. The same may apply to members of Trump's administration who helped broker the ceasefire deal, including Doha business partner Witkoff and Kushner. In addition, Democrats who oppose Israel, those in the GOP that would prefer to withdraw completely from the Middle East, a group that may include U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as far more marginal figures like the anti-Semitic Tucker Carlson, will also be loud opponents of American support for renewal of fighting to force Hamas's surrender. After the hostage release, we should be prepared for the international community, as well as Qatar and the Americans, over whom it exerts some influence, to begin beating the drums again for a process that will lead to a Palestinian state. We talked about that yesterday. We've been talking about that every single day. Trump and most of the Arab states may not actually want that, but it's far from certain that their commitment to a Hamas-free Gaza is greater than their desire to maintain a ceasefire, no matter what the terrorists do. All right, and this leads us now to the second reason why Hamas thinks it can still hold on to Gaza, even after the hostages are free. Israelis are, for understandable reasons, weary of the 2-year war that was forced on them after October 7, 2023. The maintenance of the large army of the so-called and the called-up reservists have placed, and this is really true, an enormous strain on these heroic soldiers, their families, as well as the Israeli economy. Sending the defense forces back into the maelstrom of Gaza to ensure that Hamas doesn't reconstitute the terrorist state they ruled before October 7th. It'd be an enormous letdown for the Israelis. It's almost like yesterday was a collective sigh of relief, a collective exhaling. And so this is where we're at right now. And so bottom line is this. It's very sobering. Unless Trump is prepared to be tough-minded, as he often claims to be, and Israelis are ready to resume a war they prefer were over, these are the factors that may cause Hamas to refuse to budge from Gaza and to think they can get away with it. What follows the release of the hostages will be joy, which has been, And there's the assumption that there will be peace, and the assumption that it will be peace or anything like it may not only be wrong, but it may be a path towards the revival of a Hamas-run Palestinian state in Gaza, which is a guarantee of more massacres like the one that took place 2 years ago. And that's the upshot of the article. There's a lot more there, but I think you get the drift. And here's the key. Sadly, this seems to be where all of this is going. Hamas has zero incentive, no incentive of giving up easily, and will continue to make demands, stall for time. And if so, does Israel, the U.S., and the world have the stomach for more fighting? That's the big question. Only time will tell. And herein lies the next two stories illustrate the problem. A mother of a slain hostage says the government betrayed families like hers because the deal has left insufficient leverage on Hamas to get the bodies back. She told this to Channel 12 Israel that the government's actually betrayed the families whose loved ones were killed in captivity and have not been returned. They're supposed to get 28 hostages back. They only got four back, and there's nothing really that can be done. Now, she says Hamas didn't breach the agreement, arguing the way it was drafted. Israel gave them no absolute deadline. The terms of the deal were not definitive, and she's right, they weren't, as to what might happen if Hamas failed to return all the bodies. With some leeway for ongoing search for the body, she says might go on for months or years. Remember, we did a story actually was a week or two back about one Hamas person says it's going to take months to get the hostages back. Now, I wasn't talking about the living ones. He's talking about the dead ones. So they say, oh, we don't know where they all are. Remember yesterday, if a building fell on, where some of these hostages had died and there's rubble there, we don't know, it would take forever to get to them. So they're there scattered across Gaza. So it's a problem. And all we could find is four of the 28. And so here's the bottom line. Hamas, it seems, has outsmarted the U.S. and Israel with respect to the deceased hostages. Their non-release leads us to the next problem. And here's our final story, but here's what puts it all in perspective. Headline number 3. After Hamas breaches the deal, Israel fears the group is hiding. They've got the deceased hostages. They're hiding them for future negotiations. Israel had expected only a small number of hostage bodies to be returned after the 72-hour deadline following the IDF pullback to the yellow line, but not as few as 4. I mean, they thought there'd be a lot more than that. Jerusalem is unlikely to react harshly. Why? So as not to spoil Trump's celebration. Israeli officials said they do not believe Hamas's claims that they don't know the whereabouts of other deceased hostages. The small number also contradicts the previous statements by Hamas during negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, where it said it knew the location of a larger group of hostage remains. While Israeli officials had anticipated a small single-digit number of bodies might be returned on yesterday, they didn't expect the number to be as low as 4. So Israeli defense officials say if Hamas fails to cooperate fully in the process of returning the remaining bodies, Israel will assume the terror group is deliberately withholding them to retain leverage in future negotiations. So discussions are underway to figure out what in the world do we do now? What do we do? Because we're between the proverbial rock and the hard place. Hamas does not want to give up its weapons, does not want to give up its rulership over Gaza. And they will say, well, now we've still got to negotiate the second part. And this is the whole point. Second part of the deal. We've come through with the first part, as we said, got the ceasefire. But now part number 2. And we're not going to give up our weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got leverage here because we've still got 24 hostage bodies that are there. All right. So is this true? Is Hamas outsmarted the Israelis and the Americans, giving back only some of the deceased hostages so it could prolong their grip over Gaza, rebuild their military, and look forward to another October 7th? All right. At the end of the day, we don't know what's all going to take place in the short term. However, and here's the good news, which we always illustrate here. We do know where everyone will eventually line up before the return of Christ. We have documented this from our books on Bible prophecy. There's 4 of them in particular we want to mention. 25 signs were near the end. The final Antichrist, the coming Caesar, that book. Book number 3, the Jews, Jerusalem, and the coming temple. And book number 4, look up a timeline of 50 last days events. There are 4 of our 12 books that we have on our website, Educating Our World, on the subject of Bible prophecy. They're free downloads, so please take advantage of them. Because from these 4, 25 signs, final Antichrist, the Jews, Jerusalem, the coming temple, and look up the timeline of 50 last days events, you will have a thorough understanding of what is going on right now, what has been predicted, and what will take place in the future. So we wait and see. What's going to happen? Again, in the short term, we don't know, but we do know what's going to happen in the long term. That's why we rejoice here every day. I'm Don Stewart. We'll see you about noon Pacific time for a second edition of Breaking News, and again at 2 p.m. Pacific with me and Tom Hughes answering your questions and talking about the situation in the Middle East. Until then, as always, may the Lord richly, richly bless.